Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session before lunch, the best one, I think, slightly biased, talking about patient voice in clinical trial design and trying to have some practical tips and discussion around experiences people have really had and not only sticking with theory or exactly what we should do, because rarely do we have the opportunity to do things the way we always intend. So disclaimer, all of the opinions are those of the speakers and not of their employers, including FDA. I will trust that all of you can read bios, and so I don't want to spend too much of our precious time speaking of everyone on the panel, though everyone is pretty amazing. Well, with the exception of myself, but I'm Nicki. I'm at Open Health, work in Endpoint Strategy and COA Measurement. I'm excited to be here. Thanks to Maria Matera for inviting us to participate, and to Taryn Ho for making sure it all came together and can actually be presented. The presenters today, Pujita from Sanofi, or Sanofi, I'm never quite sure, but I'm gonna go with Sanofi today. And then Amanda from Takeda. So some really great just grounding to get us some information to have a good discussion around how we're incorporating the patient perspective and experience into what we do every day. And then some pretty amazing panelists. I shouldn't sound surprised. I mean, they're always really amazing, but these are people I didn't know. I had never met them before. I've just been incredibly impressed, and I have to say I've learned a ton, even just in preparing for this. So thank you in advance to the panelists for sharing all of your experience and wisdom. But Sam from International Rare Disease Research Consortium, but please do read these bios, because the background and the breadth and depth of experience is really impressive, and I think we'll hear a lot of that in the comments today. And then Dominique Pichard with International Rett Syndrome Foundation. And then Cindy Grossman, who did introduce herself briefly earlier with a question here from CDRH at FDA. And please feel free to introduce yourselves before speaking if I haven't done it justice, but I think I got the names correct. So we're going to go with that. Overview of, so we all know what to expect. I'm going to do my very best to keep us on time. So please excuse me if anything I say seems rude or if I cut anyone off. I do want to make sure we get to all the good information. So a little bit of an overview. We'll have the presentations from Pujita and Amanda to set the stage a little bit about strategy and how it might look in industry to incorporate the patient voice and patient experience data, and then some more pragmatic information and some case studies, and then discussing with the panel and their experience with these issues a bit, and then opening for Q&A. So please be thinking about what questions you may want to ask. And to reiterate from earlier, please make it a question. I appreciate the commentary, and I'm happy to hear all of it over lunch, but not in a microphone. I'm going to keep us moving along. And here are our objectives. So again, the strategic considerations, some practical considerations, and a little bit about the regulatory and patient perspective. So if we want to open it up beyond regulatory audiences, I'm really open to that as well. And the panel knows that the notes that we have, and anything could stray. So whatever questions come to mind, please feel comfortable asking them. And so just a little bit of an introduction to why we're talking about this. I always am, after I've been in the field and industry for nearly 20 years, and it's amazing to me when I hear, well, everyone's focused more recently on patient centricity. I don't know what we were focused on before. Like, I don't know where we thought the drugs were going, or who we thought they were being made for, or who was buying them. But everything should be patient-centric. I think if we come to the table assuming that we all have the best interest of the patient at heart, which I know for some of us, depending on where you are, that can be a big assumption for a colleague or two. But for the most part, everyone does come to the table wanting that same North Star. I think where It gets difficult is when we break down into the different silos that we have or the different expertise that we bring to the table. Are we listening to each other? And are we coordinating those efforts? Are we understanding what are we trying to get out of this patient experience data? Over the past 3 months, I've moderated a session at Scope on DHT, patient centricity, ISPOR, patient centricity in HTA. Most recently, I was at Medical Affairs Professional Society, a workshop on patient-focused drug development. And it's really interesting how different those sessions were. But the theme being, everyone is coming to the table with their expertise of this is how I do it in my part of the world. But we have commercial, we have medical affairs, we have clinical development, we have human factors, we have manufacturing. All of these pieces have their patient engagement component more and more. So it's helpful, I think, to hear about how we could be doing things, which I always think of as the system from which we deviate, and then what that really looks like in practice. Because it's a huge puzzle to try and put together in industry when you have from early phase to late phase, all of the different components. And then when you think about drug development historically is really molecular asset focused. Patient-focused drug development is really based around indication and therapeutic area, ideally. And those don't always work well together, especially if you end-license something, if you aren't doing a phase 2 because it's a line extension, if it's an additional indication, if it's a really safe molecule that's just looking around for a home. We know it does something, we're not quite sure, and so we don't have a target patient population yet. All of these situations happen, and we're trying to bring the patient to the center. So we, as a panel, we solved it. We fixed it for you. You're welcome in advance. So we will spend the next 64 minutes telling you how to do it. No, I'm just kidding. That is a joke. Don't email me and ask. With all due respect, I don't think, you missed a point. But we will talk about what we've been through and hopefully some really good takeaways. And hopefully a really good discussion with the Q&A. So with that, I will pass on to Pujita and then Amanda. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Nicki, and thank you everyone for having me here today. So we've already done an introduction, so I won't go through that, but today I'm going to show you how patient voice is reshaping medical product development and regulatory decision-making overall. So across the globe, regulators are really truly aligning on a shared goal, the recognition and goal of that patients must have a voice in how medicines are developed and in overall decision-making. You heard earlier from Robin and a great panel of others as well around what FDA has been doing, and really this work started, she had the timeline over a decade ago, even before that with the PRO guidance, but really establishing those formal programs. And then very closely behind is EMA, with most recently their publication of their reflection paper on patient experience data. And today, other regulators as well are really building and working on building that framework to bring patient experience data into development programs and decision making. And earlier, Robin also mentioned ICH, so I do want to mention that there's that harmonization efforts, right, to really develop guidelines around patient-focused drug development. The first is on patient preference information. Following ones, hopefully there's in line for clinical outcomes assessment. So really building on that, and this is that opportunity to really be able to come together and harmonize. So don't expect you to read this slide, but it is just to indicate that patient voice and patient experience data is a shared priority, not just for regulators, but across the entire ecosystem. And the table on the left there really it's pulled from an FDA guidance. It's not part of the 4 series guidance. It is part of one of our commitments from PFDD, patient-focused drug development, though, really highlighting the key stakeholders who rely on the patient experience data, how it can inform different decision makings for different stakeholders. This is some, it does not include all, so I do recognize that our payers, HTA bodies, all of those are not reflected there. What I want to highlight is that both FDA and EMA, and these are the tables here on the other side, they both now include a patient experience data table in their review documents. These tables show that what data was submitted and how it was considered in regulatory decision-making. And this really helps to create that feedback loop, right? First, sponsors and other stakeholders strategically collect and submit patient experience data to health authorities, obviously with us informing our decisions throughout the development of our programs. Second, then the regulators then review that data and then document that to indicate how it informed their thinking as appropriate. And then third, patients, advocacy groups, industry, the broader community can see through these publicly available regulatory documents how that patient voice actually shaped a particular regulatory decision. So this engagement of, with engaging with patients and generating patient experience data must be strategic and must be intentional, because there is that feedback loop. Based on what we see in the regulatory documents, then we can go and revise our strategies if necessary. Think about how others are doing it and really move forward from there. So patient experience data patient experience data collected by engaging patients is really valuable once we can actually translate it into overall development strategy and regulatory strategy overall. And that really means embedding that patient voice early and throughout the development to inform various decisions that we have. I won't walk through that, you can read that. And then not just to inform our decision making internally, embedding that, but then having those regulatory interactions and conversations on what's being collected, how are you collecting it, and having those proactive regulatory interactions. Those health authority engagements are very critical. Those are sort of like our de-risking tool, I would say. So by seeking that feedback on methodology, regulatory expectations up front, it actually helps us to avoid costly course corrections that we may need to happen later in development if we hadn't had those engagements. So then at Sanofi, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing at Sanofi. We've built a comprehensive framework. We call it the patient disease strategy with a clear purpose, and it's to ensure that our medicines address what patients truly prioritize and reflect that the health-related value that matters most to them. But this isn't just a development framework. We've built on that. It sort of serves as that foundation from which we've built other documents. So each patient disease strategy includes a dedicated patient stakeholder engagement strategy plan as well, defining how, when, who, where we engage with the patient community. So this then ensures that we have that proactive, comprehensive roadmap for meaningful partnerships and engagement with the community, and it's not just something that happens ad hoc. In this framework, in the strategy framework that you see, it's really building from the very beginning in the preclinical, early phase 1, mapping the unmet needs, the disease burden, and what patients actually experience and prioritize. Then slowly building on that to convert that into those insights into more rigorous fit-for-purpose evidence, outcomes assessments, benefit-risk perspectives, but developed by working with the patients themselves. Then that evidence as we move into phase 3 and onwards, that evidence then slowly helps shape that regulatory narrative from the ground up, so it's not something that we're retrofitting. And then it doesn't stop there. It moves on thinking after, beyond approval as well, thinking about real-world data, patient adherence, long-term safety, and cost effectiveness to really capture that full life cycle overall. I do want to note here, when it comes to the patient disease strategy, how it's developed internally is we bring a cross-functional leadership team together, work with them, work with others, work with the patient community, and then that is it's blessed by them, right? Then there's complete buy-in, and from that foundation, we build up. So our overall strategy centers on this, right, around the patient disease strategy. But from there, earlier I talked about the patient engagement strategy plan. Then we also have the target value proposition, which we develop, where we define upfront what patients, clinicians, payers, and regulators expect from new medicines. Then we also have the integrated evidence generation plan, which is a roadmap for gathering that evidence systematically. Thinking then about structured benefit risk assessment continuously to evaluate whether the benefits outweigh the risk for the patient populations. And also then thinking about, what we develop. We focus on the patient-relevant label strategies as well to help make sure that patients can interpret our science and make informed treatment decisions. So this sort of integrated approach, building on the previous slide in here, ensures that patient voice doesn't just get heard, but it fundamentally shapes every decision we make from the molecule to the market overall. Now, I want to talk about, how this is in practice and in reality, and I'll be walking through a few case examples as well after this. So taking that and turning patient insights into, those development decisions that we need to make internally. So first we start with going deep and understanding the patient needs. Then it's about how do we translate that and interpret those needs into actual priorities and actions so that it results in trials that patients actually want to enroll, treatments that patients actually value and actually use, and evidence that all stakeholders actually value overall. So here's a quick example that I want to pull up. We were designing, this is for dermatology, for a derm case study. We're designing a 52-week extension study for chronic conditions, HS, atopic dermatitis. The daily symptom tracking through PROs measures was critical for understanding that sustained treatment benefit. But what we often saw that it was eliminated in long-term extension studies, which created this gap in that understanding of sustained treatment benefit. So what we did was we brought patients into the design process, and this was around the phase 2, through an advisory board to work with them to help identify real-world barriers and opportunities for simplification. What we heard from the patients was around, how the proposed daily PRO collection approach using that separate device actually would cause a lot of either battery issues, separate device maintenance issues, missing data because of not being able to collect systematically. And hearing this, what we internally did was we took action from that, right? What we thought was best was rather than having them have two different devices, we implemented a bring your own device approach, right? A very simple thing where you would think, oh yeah, well, why didn't we just do that from the beginning? But it's hearing from the patients, understanding that, then that would now help patients track their symptoms on their own phones 1 week out of every 4 weeks. And this is then able to then capture that critical long-term data the stakeholders, all of the various stakeholders need to understand that sustained treatment benefit with that minimal patient burden and value that outweighs that minimal trial complexity that comes to play. In the interest of time, you will have these slides, or you can take a snap of this. This is another example that I wanted to show, but you can take a look at it later as I do want to move on. So I've talked about sort of the way that, how patient voice has reshaped our programs and thinking. I want to move into thinking about measuring that impact overall. Right? Sanofi's patient community promise was built with patients, caregivers, and advocacy groups worldwide, and it commits to one fundamental principle of developing medicines that reflect what patients actually need and want. So to measure that, we measure our impact against the patient promise, which gives us that evidence to demonstrate that patient priorities are really helping to shape real decisions across the pipeline. And some of the numbers I just want to show here is in 2025, we were able to track that, out of the 44 drug programs affecting 59 disease indications across our 163 studies, they were all informed by patient insights. all of our programs, R&D programs, integrated that patient input. They had, for US trials, they had the diversity and inclusion goals, and 100% of the global regulatory filings included patient experience data in our submission dossier. So it is really on us to make these studies for the patients less burdensome and more meaningful overall. And that responsibility really shows up in some of the details here. Key protocol elements like endpoints, inclusion, exclusion criteria, procedures, study duration, visit schedules, and treatment administration. All of these were refined based on that direct patient perspective overall. And we achieve this by engaging early, testing solutions in the real world, collaborating with patient advocacy groups as true partners and with patients as true partners. Having that study team buy-in and commitment to incorporating the patient voice and really being able to balance the patient needs with the regulatory considerations that are out there. So with that, I do want to just end by saying, everything we've discussed today, the regulatory momentum, the frameworks, the regulatory frameworks, the case studies, the metrics, it really comes down to thinking about three main things. Patient first, the patient priorities are not optional. It's essential for us to collect that, right? So when we build on that development programs around what patients actually experience and prioritize, we create medicines that they can access, trials they will want to join, and treatments that they will actually take eventually. We need to be intentional and strategic when it comes to our patient engagement and health authority engagement overall. And that requires first working internally to figure that out, right? It requires cross-functional commitment, early planning, and a clear vision of what that outcome needs to be from the very beginning of preclinical all the way through post-marketing. And finally, transparency really builds trust overall. So when sponsors and regulators openly share how the patient experience and how those interactions with the patients have informed our decision, it creates that vital feedback loop that elevates the standard for our entire ecosystem overall. So with that, I will now turn it over to Amanda.
You can see we learned from our earlier presenters. Thank you so much. We know that it's impossible to read that screen. Well, good morning, everyone. As Nicki had mentioned earlier, my name is Amanda Decoker, and I'm head of the Patient Engagement, Experience, and Recruitment team within Takeda. And what that means is that I have three core responsibilities. First, patient engagement in the service of clinical trials, which will be the focus of my presentation today. We're also responsible for patient recruitment and retention within any of our given clinical trials. And lastly, what I find equally important, participant stipend, reimbursement, and travel. How do we really ease that burden for patients once they randomize into clinical trials, either financially or logistically? So with that said, and as you can hear, my team is very operationally focused. So within this presentation, I'll be talking about practical considerations, and I just got so excited, I didn't even advance it. No, I'm sorry. I got so excited. Within this presentation, I'll be talking about practical considerations for executing patient engagement in clinical research. And I think we can all agree that patient engagement is important, but translating that belief into consistent, compliant, and impactful execution can be challenging. This presentation focuses less on the why of patient engagement and what we know today, what we know each and every day in terms of moving forward, and more so on the how. To how do we actually do this within real-world clinical trial constraints? Ooh, throwing things around already. When we talk about patient engagement, and we've already heard this in a number of presentations today, we're referring to activities that involve patients or caregivers outside of clinical trial participation with the goal of informing decisions. And this will be a key theme that you'll hear on almost every slide that I speak to today. This could include protocol design, this could include visit schedules, endpoints, recruitment approaches, or patient-facing materials, just to name a few. It's also important to clarify what patient engagement is not. It's not marketing. It's not recruitment alone, and it's not collecting antidotes that don't lead to action. Effective engagement is intentional, it's structured, and it's tied to decision-making. Now, clinical trials, and I think we can all attest to this, continue to become more complex. Takeda is no exception in that rule. More visits, more procedures, and greater burden on patients and caregivers. At the same time, recruitment and retention challenges haven't gone away. I can attest to this. 20 years, recruitment and retention, it has only worsened. Regulators, payers, and patient communities are expecting more meaningful patient-centric approaches, not just statements of intent. The question most organizations are facing today isn't whether to engage patients, but how do you do so in a way that is practical, compliant, and actually influences outcomes? Now, one of the most common reasons patient engagement efforts fall flat is that teams start with the activity instead of the purpose. Before engaging patients, it's critical to be clear on what decision the input will inform and what might change as a result. If patient feedback would not influence the decision one way or another, that's when we need to pause. We need to reassess. We need to understand truly what is most influential at this point in terms of informing our patients. Successful engagement starts by designing backward from the decision that you're trying to support. Now, not all engagement methods are created equal, and I think it's very important to note that more engagement doesn't necessarily mean better engagement. The key is to match the method to the objective. And you'll see within the current chart that I have a number of goals and practical methods. Early in development, advisory boards or interviews may be most appropriate. For understanding trial burdens, surveys or diary reviews can be effective. For recruitment challenges, message testing or journey mapping may be more useful. Right-sizing engagement helps ensure insights are actionable and respectful of our patients' time. Now, even when teams agree on the value of patient engagement, execution often breaks down at the operational level. And what do I mean by that? If we look at the current schematic, drawing left to right, timing. Timing is critical. Engaging patients too late limits the ability to act on insights. We've heard that theme time and time again already today. Compensation, accessibility, resourcing also require careful planning to ensure that activities are inclusive and compliant. Perhaps most importantly, engagement should be built into study planning rather than treated as an add-on activity once timelines are set. Now, legal and compliance concerns, and this is something I live through every day, are often cited as barriers to patient engagement. But many of these challenges can be addressed with early planning. Common issues may include fair market value, privacy, consent, promotional boundaries. Organizations that enable engagement tend to have pre-approved frameworks, standardized templates, and early involvement from legal and compliance partners. When engagement is clearly positioned as insight gathering and not trial participation, it becomes much easier to operationalize responsibly. Now, the most critical and often overlooked step in patient engagement is translating insights into action. So basic, but harder than many realize. Collecting feedback without acting on it risks disengaging both the patients as well as your internal teams. Best practices include summarizing insights into decision-ready formats and clearly linking feedback to specific changes, or let's be very honest, when changes can't be made, we're also documenting that as well and why. Closing the loop internally builds trust and demonstrates that patient input is taken seriously. Now, I did want to provide one case study to really build upon what we've already heard in previous presentations. And where we were able to do this most recently is within a pediatric psoriasis portfolio. My team organized a patient engagement planning workshop, bringing together broad cross-functional groups. And what we did within that workshop is that we identified unmet needs, particularly around the experiences of children and adolescents living with psoriasis. Post this workshop, my team then partnered with a patient engagement vendor to develop and execute an electronic survey to 130 parents and guardians in both the US and UK to gather insights on the conditions. Now, while that was fundamental in terms of understanding this holistic perspective, we then took that a step further and developed an in-depth interview guide and completed these interviews with 15 caregivers to further explore key themes. Now, what we gleaned from these activities were key findings that drove action. And again, these may seem very basic to you, but when you think about truly operationalizing a clinical trial, each and every insight is important. And what we identified were a number of key takeaways, which you see within the slide, but I'm going to highlight 3 for consideration today. The first, and again, what may come across as very basic in nature, is we heard loud and clear from caregivers and guardians that the maximum amount of time that they could stay in clinic was 2 hours. And the fewer the clinic visits, the better. So again, seems so basic, but what we were able to do is take this feedback, take this data back to our clinical science team, who built a phenomenal protocol, but one that was based on very clear objectives that they identified, and reevaluate and remove some of those clinic visits and replace them with telephone visits. Again, basic, but can make all the difference to a parent being able to participate in a clinical trial with their child. The second was the expectation that caregivers expected monetary compensation for their clinical trial participation. And as you heard me mention at the onset of this presentation, my team is also responsible for stipend development, reimbursement. We very much want to remove any of those logistical or financial challenges. So as such, we were able to implement a stipend as part of the trial design, $125 for a standard visit, and understanding that not all visits are created equal, we did increase that stipend to $160 per visit, where we had a 4-hour post-dose PK visit. Again, truly taking into consideration what these patients and parents needed to be able to participate. Lastly, caregivers also expressed concern around other children and the childcare that may be required. So as such, we did modify to include in all of our site budgets reimbursement for childcare, as well as including that in our participant stipend reimbursement and vendor contracts as well. Now, as you can see, measuring success in patient engagement doesn't require complex metrics. The most meaningful indicators focus on whether insights influence decision, improve study design, or supported recruitment and retention. Over time, organizations mature from simply reporting that engagement occurred to understanding and demonstrating how patient input changed outcomes. That shift is key to sustaining engagement for the long term. And in summary, knowing that time is of the essence, to summarize, effective patient engagement is purpose-driven, it is cross-functional, and it's focused on impact. When engagement is planned early, executed thoughtfully, and tied to real decisions, it supports better science and better patient experiences. Ultimately, patient engagement isn't extra work. It's a smarter way to design and run clinical research. With that said, I thank you very much for your time, and I will turn it back over to Nicki.
Thanks very much. I'd like to hear a little bit from our panel, especially those of you who haven't had a chance to sort of voice your opinion and talk about your experiences. But please do be thinking about questions that you might have, because I think this sets us up for a really meaningful and important conversation. So this is like not as substantial as it might look. If I knock it over, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm just gonna really strong. Okay, so Dominique, I'd like to start with you to get your thoughts on what we've heard about today, especially given your, I think, really unique cross-sectional experience, being a clinician, also an advocate mom. What have you seen as far as the structural barriers or any systemic barriers, given what we've heard about the importance of building relationships and taking that time to work with patients?
Thanks so much, Nicki, for the question. I think that two of the biggest barriers I see, one that we've heard about a lot is timing. We heard from both Pujita and Amanda that early engagement is really critical, but also trust. This is trust that the community has in the individual that's seeking that feedback, so usually the sponsor, sometimes an advocacy group on behalf of a sponsor, but also the sponsor trusting what they're hearing. And at the International Rett Syndrome Foundation, I started a clinical trial consortium with the idea that when sponsors are going to bring a clinical trial to the Rett syndrome community in the US, we wanted to ensure that these trials were best designed for the community. We know that sponsors have a deep expertise in the work that they do. They do not have a deep expertise in the disorder. That is something that we have and our KOLs have. So we created a consortium that's made up of KOLs as well as caregivers. And sponsors present to this consortium. They ask their scientific questions, but also get caregiver input on their proposed, the product as well as their proposed trial. And this is done before the protocol goes to any regulatory agency so that it's early enough that changes can be made. When we first implemented this, I found that that trust piece wasn't fully established. And sponsors weren't sure if they should trust what they were hearing, particularly from the caregivers. So they may have trusted what they heard from the KOLs, because often these are individuals that they're engaging individually. And what we're able to do is provide unified feedback from KOLs with the caregiver voice incorporated. And it also allows the KOLs to learn more from the caregivers on what trials should look like. So that trust piece leads to protocols that move forward without that, that feedback truly incorporated. And we've seen that, and there have been errors, and it results in challenges and trust broken then leading into trials. You know, we're now very well established, and we have this really great process, and sponsors often come to us early, before they even have a protocol. They're coming at a phase where they have a synopsis, and they want to get that feedback, really speaking to what we heard. You have to engage early. So I think that trust and the timing are two of the key barriers that I've seen.
Thanks. And anyone else on the panel who'd like to jump in, please don't feel as though you need to wait for me to call on you. That said, Sam, I'm going to call on you. Just following on and hearing the thoughts from Dominique, you also have a very unique experience working for more traditional pharma and then in a startup with a parent founder, CEO. How has that impacted patient engagement overall? Are there lessons learned in any scenario that can be applied in the other?
Thanks very much for the question. So I now describe myself as a dinosaur in the industry and have been now just focused on rare diseases for nearly 30 years. And have really sort of quite back in sort of the early 2000s already thinking about collecting patient experience and thinking about this, and we've evolved massively, I think. And then I've had lots of luck because I did at one point, I'm now working for a company called Italfarmaco, so we're a larger company. I'm also representing the International Rare Disease Research Consortium, thinking about all these discussions and how we collaborate better. But I had a unique opportunity, yes, of working with a mum who had a kid with Sanfilippo. And it was extraordinary. I think every day was a year in terms of learning, and it was all around, and some of the differences, and this is what I think, thinking about now, how we bridge that. And this discussion has come about, and we were discussing this yesterday, even though we're preaching to the choir here, we all know that we need patient experience data. We need to engage with patients early, continuously, throughout our drug development. But yet sometimes, it's difficult bringing that back into companies. So the learning that, I love and try to bridge between that was the urgency for treatment as well. The absolute urgency that decisions need to be made, and you're very sort of close to that lived experience by definition. Also, hearing yesterday, some of the things that you're doing in that field, I think it might not just be because it's patient-driven, but also in some of the smaller biotech, is you're looking at very novel outcomes sometimes. You're willing to take the risk. And you're willing to do that because, as I said, you're close to that patient community. And there's an understanding of the granularity of disease. And looking at some of the outcomes that might be quite binary, and understanding that if we can capture that granularity, it's the granularity that's really meaningful in everyday lives. So talking to regulators sometimes easy, talking to payers and HTA about that granularity and how it changes is really tough. So those were the learnings, and picking up on what Dominique said as well. I think that working in that community, sometimes you have to be really you're honest with the community, because again, you're having that lived experience, and that gains trust. And so what you're now seeing in larger companies is, you have many more resources, and not only the resources in terms of finance, in terms of people, you've got great brains. You know, you've got people that are coming from different perspectives. So you've got all of that. You've got more rigor. You've got the possibility of doing much larger clinical trials. So it's trying to capture some of that urgency and understanding that we have to work together and collaboratively to really, truly make a difference. So that's a little bit answered. I hope that answers your question.
It does. I just have one follow-up question. I'm struck by the issue of trust that Dominique mentioned around what does it take to trust the feedback that patients are giving us? And in your experiences across different types of companies, have you seen any differences around the willingness of leadership or the willingness of decision makers to trust and act upon?
I do. I mean, I do. I think that's absolutely true. I think, you know, there's trust in two ways. So I think there was one thing about trust within a company and understanding the meaningfulness of those outcomes. And I thought there was a very interesting quote at ISPOR recently where somebody said, if you replace the word clinical with patient, so clinical reported outcomes versus patient-reported outcome, oftentimes internally, I'm not talking about regulatory, but internally within companies as well, there might be an understanding that there's less science or less rigor behind those. And it's really not about that difference. So I think that was the trust that you were referring to, but I think it's really about then education and training, how we can ensure that the rigor behind how we're collecting that is, you know, it has the same level. If not, actually, it's much more important, right, Dominique?
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And Cindy, I'd love to hear your perspective, sitting within FDA, what you see, because I would just love to just spend a year to be a fly on the wall and understand, because the perspective has got to be frustrating, I imagine. What are you seeing from a systemic barriers perspective, or what could be done better? And then also I'd love to get your thoughts too on, does FDA, not that you're speaking for the agency of course, but from your experience, are there differences in trusting patient data versus KOL or clinician data, and what tips the scales? Like, what do you need to see for different kinds of decision making in order to trust the patient experience data and patient voice? That's a really big question with multiple components. Sorry, Michelle.
Yeah, multiple components. Well, I want to get back to something that you said, Nicki, which is, about kind of this mosaic and all these different expertise focused on patient engagement, and you mentioned human factors as one. So for those of you who are less familiar with a CDRH and the device landscape, we regulate over 240,000 medical devices, everything from things that are over the counter like pulse oximeters to durable medical equipment, and never mind all the radiation emitting devices as well. So it's a big suite of heterogeneous devices that we regulate. And my group, the Division of Patient-Centered Development that I'm privileged to lead, really focuses kind of on two sides of this coin. We have the patient experience data or patient science side of our house, and then we have the patient engagement side of the house. And, I think a lot of the things that the panelists have said resonate with the device landscape. I think one thing Amanda said was, a lot of people start their patient engagement with the activity and not the purpose. A lot of folks pick a measure and don't tell us exactly what you're using it for and align it with what the context of use is and the disease and the condition and what the patient's experiencing and all of that. So I think that really resonates. I think we also within the medical device Center for Devices and Radiological Health, we have also tools that we're trying to put out there through our device development tool program, our MDDT program. And through that program, we're trying to have tools like clinical outcome assessment tools that can be used for everyone. But there's a lot of contextual components to that. We're not going to get a tool for everything, for every purpose. And so we have that sort of it's not a challenge, it's just sort of the reality of the situation, which is we'll have some tools where they can be used widely, and then there are going to be always these sort of nuanced conversations. And then, of course, something that Dominique said around coming to these early engagements and early engagements with us is really important, and you heard it from our colleagues from earlier, the earlier session. So I think all of these themes of, getting over the barrier of coming to us earlier rather than later, ensuring that we have some tools out there that can be fit for purpose and used broadly, but also knowing that we need to deal with these kind of nuances. And then, of course, marrying the science with the patient engagement aspects. When you talked about how to trust the data, I really want to say how I think privileged I felt to be part of the guidance series, the patient-focused drug development guidance series, because that really level sets across COAs the types of data that's needed to be able to use in regulatory decision-making. It doesn't make a distinction between clinician-reported outcomes or patient-reported outcomes. And so it goes a long way to be able to then do the internal trainings, which we do at FDA with our review teams, on that guidance and on those guidance series. So I think that from being able to trust the evidence that comes from patients, it sets it at a level, at common ground, at the same level. And that's certainly how we talk about it internally, and how we train folks on it. But I think to come full circle, Nicki, back to sort of putting the pieces together, each party has a responsibility for their own piece of the puzzle, whether that's in device development, drug development, biologics, doesn't matter. And across those components, when there's obviously multi-component products. And so it's not so much that folks don't want to be doing this work, don't want to be sort of seeing the relevance to patients and bringing patient voice more into their decision making. It's just they don't necessarily always know how. And so being able to spend time internally and externally on those trainings and on that education and being able to connect the dots is really important.
Thanks. And I'm going to shift a little bit to just regulatory evidentiary expectations and what we're seeing. And this is really a question for everyone on the panel, though I think let's start perhaps with Pujita and Amanda. What are you seeing across different regulatory bodies, FDA, EMA, PMDA, MHRA, all the A's? And then I'm going to also throw in, we can't forget HTA. And then I'm not sure what's happening with JCA. I think we'll continue to understand JCA a little bit more. But are you seeing convergence or divergence or both with expectations around patient experience data evidence?
I can go ahead and start. Thanks, Nicki, for the question. I mean, overall, this slides I showed earlier in the conversation the previous panel had, I believe it's really working towards convergence, right? ICH is a great example where you're bringing global regulators together across the globe to come and talk about, be locked up in rooms for days to really build on. Right now they're focused on patient preference information, which is a type of patient experience data. But that thinking overall is really coming together. Folks, even some of the regulators who may not be as familiar are now slowly coming on board and understanding the value when it comes to patient preference information. So then think about that more broadly, right? FDA has really established that framework with all of the guidance documents, the programs that we have. EMA has as well right now, right? In their reflection paper, you can see a lot of alignment with how they're thinking, the definition of patient experience data with FDA's thinking. So it is slowly starting to come together. There's obviously going to be differences around, overall, framework and how the thinking is. The considerations are internally, let's say around COAs or other ties, but those are conversations. Those are opportunities for us to have those conversations with the health authorities from my perspective. So where we see divergence, we should go and talk to the agency. I was at another meeting earlier this week where they were talking about scaling innovative approaches, where someone from FDA said, if you see divergence, and you're talking to one health authority and another health authority is saying something different, come and talk to the FDA. That was the message. Tell them, let them know where there's that disagreement, where's that misalignment, because they are willing to work with you on that. So I would say take that opportunity. And it's sort of on us as sponsors to do that, because we're the ones who are having the conversations with the various health authorities. So just thinking about that strategically and building that in.
I think you summarized that beautifully across the board. The only comment that I would make, and this is really going back to your point, Nicki, about really who is that highest bar, who do we need to align to? And I do agree. I think there's been such a phenomenal converging of thought. Yes, there are still some differences in terms of what we may see in terms of degree of methodological prescription versus FDA versus what we see in Europe, et cetera. But we still, within Takeda, view that the highest bar is the FDA. The FDA, we have that harmonization with the ICH, the E22, so I think that's phenomenal. But the FDA really provides that unmatched methodological clarity. And I think for many organizations who are less mature in this space, that is a phenomenal resource for us to really take it through from theory to truly reality. So I would say that is one piece. We do have that exportability to other agencies, and I think this is the only other point I wanted to make, that we have the ability to then have these conversations, to be very transparent with agency to agency so that we can ensure that globally we're thinking through all of these needs. But those were the only two additional points that I wanted to flag.
So you can tell from my accent that I'm not from around here, right? And so what am I going to talk about? HTA. And so I think it is challenging. I think, particularly looking into Europe and thinking about, we're working in Duchenne. I think that's a really, really good example of differences in understanding about meaningfulness of outcomes, particularly reflecting on, there's 2 points with HTA. So HTA, as many of you will know, in Europe, there's now a centralized procedure, which has only just started, and there's been some additions, including patient engagement and the patient voice into that process. So those are great. Nationally, you're still evaluated at a national level, so you go and see each member state. And in reality, there are differences in the way of understanding exactly what I was talking about earlier, in terms of granularity and the meaningfulness of that granularity. There's differences in understanding about the disease itself. You need to do early advice, early education about the disease. And there's a third difference in acceptance of more novel control groups. When you're looking at, I've been doing all my career in pediatric progressive diseases. Now, this is really, really difficult. As we know, it's a moving target, and you're trying to detect change in that. And I think, so you need to have novel external control groups as well as internal, et cetera, and HTA look at that differently. So I do think, even within this group, I think bringing in that stakeholder more around these conversations would be really good. We still need to move the needle, in my humble opinion.
Any other thoughts? And Cynthia?
Maybe I'll just say, just to piggyback on that, at CDRH, we have something called the TAP pilot. We have a total product life cycle kind of framework and sort of way of looking at medical device development. And in our TAP pilot, the purpose of that was to bring in early innovators with innovative medical devices early in to a CDRH and work with them across their total product life cycle with kind of designing with the end in mind, thinking about the point at which the device would be reimbursed and patients would have access to it, and kind of working backward from there. So I think that's a really important point.
Thanks. With that, I do want to open it up to questions if anyone has one. I know we have people with microphones in the back. I also love the idea of communicating with FDA, the different expectations from agencies, but I always hear the desire to go the other direction of not the EMA is asking me for this, therefore can I do it differently? It's more the EMA accepted it, so can you do it too? Kind of like mom already said I could, so you can, yeah, you have to agree. No, not yet. Yeah.
So this is Lindsay Murray with the Critical Path Institute, and so one of my questions was, Amanda, you talked about reimbursing patients for participating in the clinical trials. Do you all reimburse the patients and the caregivers who are participating in from the beginning in like the protocol development, review of all the stages that you're looking at?
The simple answer is yes. I think it's very important that anytime we think about having patients invest any time, and we do, we begin this process at the point of CDP so that we really have those high-level conversations, bring them into protocol design at that concept. But regardless of stage, I focused on the actual clinical trial participation. But when we have patients involved earlier on, we work very closely with legal, with compliance to ensure fair market value reimbursement for their time. But yes, every stage they are compensated for their time appropriately.
I often, liken this to if you're paying a KOL their consulting fee. I mean, there's no reason that a patient or a caregiver should be a free consultant. And yes, fair market value. It may not be at the same rate that you're, giving a consultant. And I think that another thing that's important to bring up, it's not just the payment to those patients or caregivers that you're seeking input from, but if a patient or caregiver is fortunate enough to be in a crowded field, where there's numerous different programs coming into clinical trials, the burden on that patient community. And so I think that actually one thing that hasn't come up is that sponsors, I think part of that transparency that we heard about earlier is actually they should be publishing this, what they are learning, so that it is in the public domain, so that the next sponsor that comes doesn't ask the same exact questions of essentially the same exact population. There's no reason we should be duplicating this. And sometimes that's through working with the advocacy groups. They may already have done some of this work and gotten some of the information. Of course, some of it might be very product specific, and that is important to get. But the more generic information about the community, you're reimbursing them for their time and their input, but just be thoughtful about the burden on them having to do this multiple times. And it can be really painful for some patients or caregivers to be asked what they might determine as difficult experiences, to have to relive them in sharing with sponsors.
I just want to thanks for bringing that up, Dominique, because publication is key, and that is something that we definitely do at Sanofi. It's part of it. If we're engaging with the patients, now there are different levels of engagement, right? It may not be those early patient, a team that we have there. They go in and kind of assess and get those early insights. It may not be that, but anything that goes through, we have review committees internally that goes through that review committee to go and have a more solid qualitative study that's done. It's actually a requirement that we publish that data. So as part of our process, we make it a point, anything where we're engaging, we're collecting, and it's collecting the data, entering into evidence, we publish that. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that.
And hopefully first reviewing any publications so that you can target your engagement.
Sam, yeah.
I was going to make one comment on the publications and then also on payment, but something it's not submitted yet, so hopefully it'll get accepted for publication, but we were doing qualitative interviewing in Duchenne, but what we've actually put in all the, I can't think now, I'm jet lagged, not appendix, but supplemental information, is all the verbatim. So all the actual interviews and quotes that have been done as well. And I think that's the same for anything publishing natural history. Being able to publish, patient level data actually allows other people to do it, as well as things like critical path where we could submit all our, complete data. And then the other point on payment, yes, we do as well, concierge, but surprisingly, it's not actually allowed. So sometimes in certain countries, I could name the Netherlands, for example, we can't even provide concierge services for a natural history study in the Netherlands because it's considered to be non-interventional in terms of its categorization. So there's some limits. It's a shame because I completely agree with my colleagues that we should be absolutely, because it's even, these are people that not only are going into clinical trials, giving up a day's work, they've also got, I don't know, they're 200% of their, they're looking after oftentimes, somebody as well at home. So, really they should be compensated.
Another question here.
Hi. Thank you so much for the review of the patient relevance.
Name and, I know, but name and affiliation.
My name is Katja Rudel and I work for Kilo Research. And I have been in this field for some time. And I was really happy to see Pujita's discussion of how the review of the patient burden resulted in a bring your own device technology being adopted. And I haven't been to this conference for some time. So I would like to hear what the FDA has to say with regards to using those kind of instruments. Particularly, I think they're also very useful for what we listened to before, the event-driven diaries, if they're acceptable to the patients, rather than having to learn a new tool as and when, you have an event. I don't know whether that has been discussed.
So, like many things, I could probably bring up a suite of colleagues from the FDA to answer this question from different perspectives. But I think you highlight an important point, and it's actually one that I wanted to try to get in, so I appreciate it, which is that there is a list of sensor-based digital health technologies, or DHTs, that we published through our Digital Health Center of Excellence published and put out there. And so those technologies, and some of those technologies are individual devices or individual technologies, but some of them can be on your own device. And so I think when I saw that piece about, bringing your own device, I think the take home from me, from the FDA perspective, wasn't the decision to use your own device or not. It was the engagement that went into making that decision, right? That's the justification for making that decision. It's an evidence-based, informed decision from the point of view of a patient engagement exercise that's done, thoughtfully and for a purpose. And I think that's really the piece. I would be remiss if I didn't also shout out our colleagues at CEDAR who are working hard and doing great leadership in decentralized clinical trials. And of course, across the agency, that's something that we're attending to and really wanting to support how can we reduce the burden on the part of participants to participate in clinical trials for devices, drugs, biologics, et cetera. But it is really, the take-home message for me on that one was really the patient engagement that went into making that decision.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that it really depends, probably. I know we have another question over here, but I see Michelle maybe has a comment, and it would be helpful to hear also some CEDAR.
I really like your approach, Nicki, of just, ask for forgiveness later. I will say quickly on that, we may be losing opportunities for novel things to come through when we repeat the past, right? There may be better things. But actually my comment was something that Dominique said, and I pray that Marco does not hate me when I'm about to say. There are people in this room who have heard me say this, and they've heard me upset a lot of KOLs. In our diseases, particularly in our rare disease space, we are so reliant on our clinicians and our KOLs for their opinion. And plenty of times I have a sponsor sitting across from me and I'm like, so what does the caregiver think? I don't care. Literally, I have fought with KOLs. So in incorporating the patient experience and the family of being able to report that in our diseases where self-report cannot happen, and that is more than just rare disease, I encourage you to look at all types of reporters, to build your evidence package and your endpoint hierarchy. It tells us a better story and helps us to be able to make a better regulatory decision. When I see 20 clinician-reported outcomes and I know I can actually get patient self-reports, I can tell you what my number one comment that I try not to say in fury is, because I work in a space where I don't get patient reliable self-report often, okay? I'm in neurology, I got a lot of rare diseases, right? But when I got a rare disease and I can get a reliable self-report, why are we not asking patients directly how they feel and function? And is this really improving that? Not that I don't trust the clinician. They have an important viewpoint. They understand the disease very well. But I think we are missing opportunities to capture a broader spectrum. And I get the hesitation internally from companies because it's risk and it costs money. But we may be actually not being as informative. So if we can make a decision and then you have to go to the HTAs and they're like, well, how does this impact the patients? And you didn't have anything in there that really actually reflected that.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Sue? Make sure that's on. I mean, obviously, yes, because I answered your question, but the microphone's not on.
Right into it. Okay. Sorry. Sue Vallo, Agios. And my question is, well, first part is really enjoyed the presentation and the from the different and the discussion, the panelists, and Nicki, she could consider COA comedy. That would probably be another.
I think that's an
skit you could
oxymoron,
do.
but okay.
Yeah. Right. So my question, particularly when a lot of us are challenged by the cost of PROs and ePro and all of that, I'm just curious, especially for the folks from Sanofi and Takeda, have you been challenged by the cost of patient engagement, and have you been able to show impact in terms of return on investment or savings in terms of recruitment and so forth?
That's a great question.
Yes, is the short answer here. So cost has been, we're always being asked to do more with less. And I think that's not isolated to industry, it's across the board. So I would say one of the top challenges we face anytime we engage with a team is just that. When you have a tight budget, what is the first thing that gets crossed off that list? Patient engagement. Not necessary. So what we've done within Takeda is really twofold. We've done much in terms of really changing that dialogue, in terms of education, bringing in key elements in terms of what we're seeing from regulatory bodies, elements alike, but also, just as I was showcasing with that case study, thinking through how we can turn these insights into action. This is not a checkbox activity. You've heard me state it throughout the course of the presentation, but being able to come back to teams and showcase how these insights informed X, reduced amendments, reduced cost, increased enrollment timelines have been very meaningful in terms of being able to shift that paradigm within our organization. But we acknowledge that we're still early in this journey. There's more that needs to be done. So I think it's a combination of education as we think about how we can commercialize at the end of the day, but then also when we're thinking about very specifically in the R&D space, showcasing concrete examples of what these insights have allowed us to do and how there is truly that ROI calculation in terms of elements, like I said, amendments, enrollment timelines, overall increase in retention of patients throughout the duration of the study is really where my team has been focusing as of late.
I'll just add, completely agree with everything that Amanda just said, very similar approach. And one of the things that we do, I showed the patient disease strategy. That's something that we develop with a cross-functional team. So you have your commercial side of the organization, you have your development side, everyone, regulatory, everyone's at the table. So it is really thinking about and showing that, how that is going to translate into value, and thinking about that and sort of working on figuring out what that disease strategy is going to look like very early on, and then using that as a basis to have those conversations with folks that internally then, as we get it to a point of thinking about, what COAs do we want to include, what PROs, do we want to do a patient preference study? But then, so that's one piece, and using that as the foundation. The second is examples. Examples are very critical. So what I myself tend to do, I'm in regulatory policy, but what I try to do is pull out these FDA examples, EMA examples, wherever I can find examples to show how patient experience has changed something, whether it's at another company or then ourselves internally how we've been able to, move the needle. Even if it's just those little minor things, that can be cost savings of a lot. So just being able, because that knowledge sharing doesn't always happen internally, so being able to capture that and then share that with others and having those examples at hand is very critical overall. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And am I allowed to I'm allowed to have an opinion. I would say what I've seen work as well is sometimes as a function, we can come in and say, we know the exact right thing to do. We need to follow this guidance to a T as though it were gospel. And the more that we're willing to show flexibility and innovation and say the right decision in this situation may not be the decision I would make in isolation based on this guidance. But given all of the factors, given all of the expertise at the table, the right decision that's fit for purpose right now is not exactly what we would do scientifically, but it might be good enough for what we're trying to accomplish. And I think it's taken a while as a field, and I may just be speaking for myself, but it's taken a while as a field to feel confident enough to do that and to go to the FDA with something that wasn't picture perfect. And so I think we're getting to that point. But yeah.
Great.
Jay?
Hi, Nicki. Jay, patient-centered outcomes at Pfizer. My question is around at many companies, patient engagement insight generation is distinct from evidence generation in support of COAs. And so my question is, are there opportunities for us to bring those together, right? Often we're going to the same patient advocacy groups, but we're kind of going at different times. We're repeating many of the same questions, particularly around disease experience and what's important to patients. So are you in your organization seeing opportunities, challenges for bringing PE insights together with COA evidence generation?
I will keep my answer very brief, seeing the 2-minute warning. So yes, as it is in Pfizer, it's the same in Takeda. We are two separate groups right now, but we acknowledge the need to work together. So you heard me mention in my case study around the patient engagement planning workshop. And this is where we have that broad cross-functional collaboration where we have global evidence and outcomes as a separate group coming to those workshops with us so that we can develop one holistic engagement plan that we then execute together and then ensure that there's one activity that informs multiple groups and we have that consistency. But again, it's a work in progress. You've heard me say that time and time again. There is still greater need, even outside of just in my organization, the reality of how we work in R&D with global evidence and outcome and my team, but then we're even trying to connect the dots with early development, with regulatory and commercialization. So I think that there's much that we within industry have to do to ensure that there is that consistency, going back to that theme of reducing burden. Not even how are we as individual sponsors, but how are we even in our own organizations duplicating efforts. So yes is the short answer, more work to be done.
I'm curious to hear I want to hear from you too, Cindy, and we have 40 seconds, so I'm going to put you both on the spot. But Sam, I want to hear, at a smaller company, where maybe you don't have as many separate groups and silos, what does it look like there?
24/7. I don't know if I can answer that in 30 seconds, but yeah, no. I mean, even in sort of mid-sized companies, we don't necessarily have all those functions, but I mean, what you're saying there, it just makes good sense that the patient engagement is kind of the umbrella, and then you've got other parts of, where by definition we're talking with patients as well. So it needs to fit in and people need to talk to each other. We don't have those problems in small because it's one person that's doing everything.
Right. And Cindy, make it profound. It's our last comment.
I said our division is two sides of the same coin, right? Patient engagement and patient science. I think one of the things that we've tried to do is have a structure to try to bridge that. We've got a patient and caregiver connection program where we engage with patient advocacy organizations, but they have agreed to have us interact with them around regulatory questions that come oftentimes from our regulatory review teams. And so being able to have that structure in place where you're kind of connecting the people who see the evidence, have to evaluate the evidence, but also have other questions for the patient advocates where they want to hear directly from the patients is helpful.
Thanks very much. I'd like to thank the panel. Lovely discussion. And Sarah has lunch instructions.
I do. Hello, everyone. We're at the beginning of our lunch, end of our morning. I almost forgot when we were in time. So if you got breakfast this morning, you already know that food is located on floor number 2 today. I would be very curious if people brought their own devices and are tracking flights of stairs. Please report to me if you take the stairs from this ballroom level up past the ground level to floor 2, how accurate that flight of stair measurement is. Please report back after the day. But we'll have about an hour for lunch. Please be back here promptly at 1:30. See you then and enjoy.